So we just need Tera on one end or the other. We're going to get started in just a few seconds. Here comes Tera. Yes.
Are you all right, Deborah, with your water?
And for some reason, I misplaced the bios, so I don't. But it wasn't in the it was in the folder, and then I picked it up and it wasn't. So I don't know where they went. That's like they were here. They were here.
Mic check. 1 2 1 2.
Okay, great.
It's interesting. The only part of myself that I'm enchanted with is my voice, because I always get compliments on my voice. And the irony is that I didn't get to read my own book, so somebody else is reading my audiobook. And my biggest asset I don't get to use. But the person who's reading, I bought the audiobook to listen.
Yeah.
So I think
Who did it?
his name, he's an actor, his name is Kaz. I never heard of him before. From the Oscar.
If you wait 5 minutes, I'll... Yes.
From trying to win a game that you can't win, the cat and mouse game, because there's no way to totally disappear it all. And so I found that the ones who make their peace with that live a bit more serene.
Everyone.
My rationale was like trying to hide in the open, but that was before I wrote a book. So now that people recognize me.
Oh, is there? Yes. Okay.
Now you're off again.
Off? Oh, now we're here. I think I keep turning it on and off.
I always take pictures of audience.
Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the closing. So, it's been a very rich 2 days. I think we're thrilled with how it went. The discussions were all fascinating, the topics diverse. I think new connections were made. We learned about new things that we didn't know about. We got to discuss our political concerns. We got to hear about literature. We also learned more about racial and gender issues, the environment. So the authors were uniformly fantastic. And there's a synergy that gets created. It's not just the individual authors, it's the collection of them. So, and here is another fabulous collection. And we could keep going on, combining them in new ways and having them do new things together, but we think we're just about at capacity now. My name is Ellen Lazarus. I organized the book festival.
Yay!
But of course, to make something like this happen, it takes a lot of different parts. And there's many, many volunteers. There's people who whether it's the author gift bags or organizing the food for the green room or organizing all the volunteers to staff the parking or staffing the parking. There's so many pieces, and I am so grateful to all of those volunteers, the site managers. There's many of the site managers in here. If you're a site manager, raise your hand. Come on. Thank you all for making this work. And to my husband, who spent the whole day scurrying around taking photographs, how great is he? And there is someone who always volunteered for us in the green room. Marcia Kaufman was a dear friend that we lost in March. And she was the most dedicated and intrepid book festival volunteer. Her family is here. We wanted to do something to celebrate her memory and her work and what her goals were in life. And one of the things that was an important subject to Marcia was empowering women. She has 2 smart, talented daughters, and she wanted them to achieve their full potential. And she knew that for a woman, it was harder. In her own personal experience, it had been harder. So the issue of gender, of course, this year, when we saw that a woman couldn't be elected president, that anyone could be elected except a woman, we knew we had a problem, and that gender issues are something that it's not up to somebody else to take care of. It's all of our problem. Women especially, but men too. So we've always been careful about how actively we address this issue, because sometimes we think that it's too much in your face. But we no longer need to be polite. It's time to talk about these issues. Why are we still talking about these issues? Why is it necessary to fight for 53% of the population? So with that in mind, we have a fabulous panel, and we also have Tera Hunter. Tera Hunter, who is part of the book festival, wrote Bound in Marriage. She is a professor in the history department and the Center for African American Studies at Princeton. She specializes in 19th and 20th century African American women and labor in the South. Gender studies are something that's very important to her, so she very kindly agreed to help us moderate this panel of 3 other book festival authors. But before I turn it over to Tera, I'd like to have Matt Kaufman, Marcia's husband, say a few words.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the panelists and to the panel chair, Sue Ellen, and to everybody else who were here. Just wanted to make a couple of sentences about Marcia. My children, Sarah, Emily, son-in-law Danny, and I are extremely grateful to the festival, Sue Ellen, and the panelists for honoring Marcia with this panel discussion. Marcia faced many challenges in the workforce as a highly educated woman who devoted her life to raising her children and then tried to re-enter the force only to meet continual rejection. Ultimately, in her 50s and 60s, she re-engineered herself, and in a women-only small business partnership became the co-author of 6 books which discuss foundational IT structure. She was entirely self-taught in the field. Many of the books, plus her consulting work, were produced while she simultaneously dealt with the treatment and complications of breast cancer, including a paper completed just a week before she started her downward spiral. I am in awe of her achievements. Her work experience plus societal developments in the 80s and 90s led her, as well as many other mothers, to specifically nurture daughters in order for them to become independent, resilient, creative, and resourceful women in their own right. Indeed, early on in Sarah's, Emily's lives as toddlers, she emphatically challenged me with essentially these words, to raise them with the same aspirations and skills as if they had been sons. She was the driving force behind their development and lived her life as a defining role model for them. It is therefore fitting today that they have assumed her role in the green room with the authors prior to their discussion. Thank you all for coming.
So thank you to the Kaufman family for your work and for sponsoring this panel. And this has been an amazing few days, and I'm sure everyone is just exhilarated by all the various activities. So it's an appropriate way to end a wonderful book festival that we talk about these issues around women's reproductive right and women's equality. The issues that we're talking about today have assumed a very prominent place in our media, in our public debates, especially during the recent healthcare debates, initiatives in Congress, as well as ongoing conversations that we've been having about economic inequality, the growing divide between rich and poor. On the healthcare side, the GOP plan was defeated by the Senate by just 3 votes. 2 of them were women. It contained a plan to cut a key provision that has been important to protecting women's reproductive rights. The plan would have cut Title X, Planned Parenthood, Medicaid, and other programs that have been providing health care for women, especially low-income women. There is apparently even an executive order, which was leaked to the press. It has been made public officially by the White House in the works, which would allow any business or organization to request exemption from providing contraceptives on religious and moral grounds. Right now, only religious institutions and certain corporations are allowed the exemption. So this would result in a huge decline of access to basic contraceptives for women. With respect to workplace equality, women on the whole still earn less than men for equivalent work, roughly 80 cents on the dollar, and women of color earn even less. Women are disproportionately represented in low-wage occupations. 59% of the lowest paid jobs belong to women. Women are overrepresented in certain fields, 79% roughly in health and social services, and underrepresented in others, only 43% in professional and scientific and technical services. In 2009, only 24% of CEOs were women, and they earn 74% as much as CEOs who are men. And that percentage is even lower for CEOs of the S&P 500 companies. Only 4% of those are women. And yet, despite these gloomy numbers, women have caught up with men in terms of education and now surpass men in earning college degrees. So this is a little bit information for us as a backdrop for our panel today. And so I would like to introduce our panelists. We have a stellar lineup of experts whose body of work has really helped to advance women's equality. And starting in alphabetical order in the middle, Dr. Willie Parker. He is an OBGYN specializing in women's health and is a reproductive justice advocate. His work includes a focus on violence against women, sexual assault prevention, and reproductive health rights through advocacy, the provision of contraceptive and abortion services, and men's reproductive rights. In 2009, he stopped practicing obstetrics to focus entirely on providing safe abortions for the women who need it the most, often women in poverty. And women of color in the Deep South. Dr. Parker then became an itinerant abortion provider in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. He sits on the board of institutions at the forefront of the fight for reproductive justice, including as the chair-elect of the Board of Physicians for Reproductive Health. He's the former medical director of Planned Parenthood of Metropolitan Washington, D.C. He's the recipient of the Planned Parenthood Sanger Award, an honor that Hillary Clinton received and Jane Fonda. He has been featured in Slate and Jezebel, Cosmopolitan, NPR's Morning Edition, Salon, and many more. He has been profiled in Esquire in 2014 and is a subject of a documentary film called Trapped, a film that deals with the legal battles around abortion clinics in the South. And he's the author of Life's Work, A Moral Argument for Choice, which was recently published. He's a graduate of Berea College of Kentucky, the University of Iowa College of Medicine, Harvard School of Public Health, the University of Cincinnati, and the University of Michigan. To my far right, Professor Deborah Tannen is the linguistics professor, a linguistics professor in the department at Georgetown University, where she's only one of 6 women in the College of Arts and Sciences.
No, 6 people.
6 people. Even better. 6
One of 2
people.
women.
6 people in the College of Arts and Sciences who hold the distinguished rank of university professor. She specializes in how the language of everyday conversation affects relationships. She's published way too many books for me to list, 25 authored, edited, co-edited, over 100 articles, and has received 5 honorary doctorates. She has received book awards and distinguished lectureships from Princeton and Stanford, among others. Outside of the academy, Professor Tannen is best known as the author of You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation. Sounds familiar, right? Which was it was on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 4 years, including 8 months as #1, and has been translated into 31 languages. Several other books have also made the Times bestseller list, including Talking from 9 to 5, Women and Men at Work, You Were Always Mom's Favorite, You're Wearing That, ? Her book, The Argument Culture, is especially relevant to events happening now as it deals with public discourse and the ways the media frames or misframes issues. And her latest book is You're the Only One I Can Tell, Inside the Language of Women's Friendships. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, an MA in English Literature from Wayne State University, and a BA in English Literature from Harper College. And last but not least, attorney Gillian Thomas is a senior staff attorney with the Women's Rights Project of the American Civil Liberties Union, where she specializes in equal employment opportunity. She previously was a senior trial attorney with the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and at NOW, Legal Defense and Education Fund, where she specialized in litigating employment discrimination cases on behalf of women in male-dominated jobs like construction and law enforcement. And she's also worked in private practice, including at Vladeck, Waldman, Elias, and Engelhardt PC in New York. She's the author of Because of Sex, 1 Law, 10 Cases, and 50 Years That Changed American Women's Lives at Work. She's a graduate of Yale College, the University of Michigan Law School, where she was a contributing editor of the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. And after law school, she clerked for the Honorable John T. Nixon of the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee. So those are our panelists. And I have lots of questions. And I'm sure you guys have questions of your own as well. So we're going to get started. So I'd like to start with sort of defining the problem as each of you see it. From the perspective of your own experiences and expertise, what do you see as the major obstacles to women's equality with respect to workplace issues and/or reproductive rights? Whichever way you want to answer those.
Starting with me. Starting in 1991, I wrote an op-ed that I called The Hillary Factor. 1992. At that point, Hillary Clinton was the wife of a candidate for president. And what I called the Hillary Factor is what I've since called at the time and have written about since as the double bind that confronts women in positions of authority. And I think this is one of the major obstacles, so I'll just quickly explain how it works. A double bind is worse than a double standard. A double standard means that women are held to a different standard than men. And that's unfair and it's wrong, but you can meet that standard. A double bind is a situation in which you have two requirements, but anything you do to fulfill one actually violates the other. Women in positions of authority confront two sets of requirements. One is what is required of a woman, and the other is what is required of a person in authority. Anything they do to fulfill what we expect of women, be self-deprecating. Don't put yourself forward. Ambition is a dirty word. I actually, side point, and op-ed I wrote about this during the primaries. I Googled the name of each of the candidates and the word ambition, and it was positive for all the guys. Bernie Sanders had an ambitious plan for something or other. Donald Trump was an ambitious real estate developer. For Hillary Clinton, it was next to evil. I mean, it was what I should have prepared by reminding myself. It was everything evil you can think of associated with ambition was associated with her. How could anyone exactly reach that level and not be ambitious? But it's a requirement for a person in authority. It is damning for a woman. She's supposed to never want to put herself forward. So she's going to be violating our expectations for a person in authority. If she does all the things that a person in authority has to do, be decisive, be confident, tell other people what to do, because that's part of your job as a person in authority, we know all those words that start with the word be that then hover around her head. And she will be judged negatively. So if she talks as she's expected to as a woman, she isn't respected. And all this, by the way, grew out of a book that I wrote called Talking from 9 to 5 about the workplace. Women were not getting promoted, and anytime a woman wasn't hired, wasn't promoted, I would ask why. She just didn't seem confident. They'd be seen as less confident and less competent than they really were because they were talking in ways they were expected to as a woman. If they talked in ways expected of a person in authority, they were respected, they were thought to be good at their work, but they weren't liked. And this is, I believe, one of the vices in which women in public life are caught in. And so it was something I observed and developed in my work on the workplace, but it is equally applicable to certainly candidates for public office and women in public life. So I think the double bind is a huge one. And it's ways of talking. I mean, that's why. Maybe I'll just add one little PS to that. So the book that I just wrote, which I was talking about here, is about women friends. And one of the things that I encountered in interviewing women was how frequent it was for women to have very painful memories of when they were in middle school or high school, and a group of girls would suddenly expel a member of their group. And one woman was telling me how guilty she felt that it was a girl she was very close to in middle school, and in high school, the same group kicked this girl out, and she said she really didn't deserve it. What she recalled was she was cute, she was good at sports, and it's true, in high school, she was making friends with the girls in the higher grades, but she really didn't deserve what we did to her. And this just was astonishing to me, because in a group of boys, the one who was physically attractive, good at sports, is the most admired of the boys. His status goes up. But there is a real tendency for girls to turn on a girl who seems better than the others. And she gets accused of being a snob, of being stuck up, thinking she's better than us. Just my last thing here, I just saw a play in New York, and there was a character there who's singing a song based on a real character. This woman was the first woman pilot at American Airlines. And in the song, she's saying how it was her first time in the cockpit, and the male pilots don't want to be there with her. They say a girl shouldn't be in the cockpit. And the flight attendants also turned on her because they were saying, "You think you're better than us." So, and I think that is a lot behind the, I just don't like her, that you got about Hillary Clinton, and that I understand people are saying as well about Elizabeth Warren.
So when I think about in my role as a women's health provider, the empowerment of allowing, or at least me facilitating women controlling their fertility, it also becomes an economic issue, because the reality is if women don't control their reproduction, they don't control much else about their lives. And so when we fetishize motherhood and we assume that the most primary identity of a woman is to bear children, it makes whatever decision she make against that either illogical or immoral. So she's either feeble of mind or not fit of spirit. And so that means that economic issues, reproductive issues, become economic issues. And so in my mind, when I get solicited often in the advocacy I do around making the case for abortion and reproductive rights, I get solicited for the tragic narratives where the woman was really sick or the pregnancy was really abnormal, as if a woman making a decision not to become a parent when she's not ready is not a valid one. And given that women, when they participate in public life, they often have to do double duty. So if you're a doctor, you also have to be a mom, such that the roles of home life aren't shared. It makes perfect sense, and it's totally rational if a woman has aspirations for a life beyond motherhood, that she would decide not to do double duty. So it really becomes an economic, if you look at the fact that a woman understanding what goes into being a parent and what the expectations are of her with regard to home life, and if she aspires for a life outside the home, that she makes the decision not to do double duty, makes her decision to control her fertility one of rational thinking around the expectations that are imposed upon her by a society that fetishizes motherhood. And it's just, it also makes her, it should fall in the realm of her having the empowerment to control all the processes that go on in her body, whether it be an economic decision, a health decision, or merely one question of her quality of life.
Yeah, my reaction, especially as an employment attorney, I think kind of synthesizes what Deborah and Willie have said. For instance, the lack of women in leadership roles, sometimes due to outright discrimination, obviously, but also due to these subtler forms of resistance to appointing women as leaders or following women as leaders, has a trickle-down effect in terms of compliance with laws, hiring decisions, HR procedures, accountability in terms of diversity within a workplace. So lack of women at the top has a lot of ripple effects. Tera referenced the pay gap, which we all know. We all know the 89 cents on the dollar for or 79 cents on the dollar. Excuse me, I got a little excited there, but no, it's 79 cents. But that's much lower for women of color. Latino women don't until October of the following year catch up to white men from the previous year's earnings. And that really is due to a lot of factors, but including discrimination. But a major one is sex segregation. That women in this country, especially women of color, continue to hold the lowest paid jobs, the part-time jobs, the jobs with no benefits, the jobs with no sick days, the jobs that may not even be, maybe for smaller employers and may not even reach the threshold for the number of employees needed to be protected by the federal laws against discrimination. It's where the women who don't speak English or might not be documented are laboring in great insecurity, whereas men tend to be concentrated in jobs held by other men with higher wages. And women who attempt to break into those worlds, if they're lucky enough to receive the training or the support to try to break into those worlds, are met with a great deal of pushback, much of which Deborah has described in her work before, the idea of someone who's a strange, who's an only family who's segregated in some way is a target. But there are really depressing studies showing that when men enter female dominated jobs like nursing, that the men make more than the women do, and when women enter high-paying male-dominated jobs, wages go down. So there's a central devaluation of women's work, much of which is care work. We could go on and on about that, and but I think that, and then the final matter again, which Willie touched on, is the issue of pregnancy and motherhood, especially again for these workers who are in jobs that have absolutely no maternity leave. They work for employers too small to qualify for the Family Medical Leave Act. You have to have 50 employees, or they haven't worked for a year under the Family Medical Leave Act. And P.S., who can take 12 weeks of unpaid leave when they're making minimum wage? I mean, no one can. Statistics show that it's only about 60% of our workforce that's covered or eligible for the FMLA, but about half of those who are eligible don't take the leave because they can't afford to take unpaid leave. And so really there are millions of women in this country who are just a paycheck away, or just one sick child away, or one pregnancy away from losing their jobs altogether. So it's this real economic insecurity stemming from not just lack of access to dependable reproductive care and being able to make those decisions, but then also once they have children, paid leave, quality child care, health coverage that will keep them and their kids well. And so it's a cycle that's unfortunately quite pernicious to break.
So I'm going to go to a question that I think is on the mind of a lot of people with respect to the Supreme Court. There's a lot of concern for both supporters of abortion rights as well as foes of abortion rights in terms of, and reproductive rights more generally, not just abortions, about the next appointment to the highest court, which can make a huge difference in terms of threatening Roe v. Wade. At the same time, while a lot of attention has focused on the future nominees and women's reproductive rights being eroded, actually, they're already being eroded without overturning Roe v. Wade. So I'd like for you guys to talk about the future of the court, but also what you think about what's going on right now, even outside of Roe v. Wade, even while it's still in place.
Well, I can tell you the functional gutting of reproductive rights at the lower court levels I call a devolution. In terms of starting with 2010 and the Tea Party sweep in response to President Obama's election, along with that sweep of making the legislature, the federal legislature, more conservative with the Tea Party, it ushered in an era where states, the governance of states flipped. So governors became more conservative, more Republican governors. Whole legislatures flipped, so that at the lower levels you had what's happened we have a president, a legislature, and increasingly the Supreme Court that's all in a line, so that there's now no more balance of power. At the state level, what that's looked like has been the passage of, on average, 90 to 100 laws a year that functionally gut the provision of Roe, whether it be waiting periods. In Mississippi, it's 24, Alabama, it's 48, Louisiana, it's 72-hour waiting period once you decide that once you seek an abortion. There's no funding in some states based on the Hyde Amendment. So there's the requirement to give women seeking abortion medical misinformation or outright lies. For example, women in Mississippi were required to be told that abortion increases their risk for breast cancer. So there are all of these things that are functionally gut the provisions of Roe, and it's made it more difficult, so that even irrespective of what happens at the Supreme Court, and in anticipation of the Supreme Court shifting, there are what have been put in place what are called trigger laws. And these trigger laws mean that when the day that that the Roe decision is overturned, abortion will automatically become illegal in those states because the laws are written in a way that they're contingent upon the status of Roe. Wow. So there's just at the lower level making, although abortion remains legal at the highest level as the law of the land, it becomes practically inaccessible. And John Oliver said abortion can't be theoretically legal. It's either legal or it's not. And it's the only way that happens is if there are providers and access.
And I'm a little out of my depth here because my specialty is employment rights. I did speak to my colleagues at the Reproductive Freedom Project before coming here, and I commend to you the ACLU's website to read more about their victories, because actually there's a blog that I'm looking at here that that came out on Thursday saying, believe it or not, it's been a good week for reproductive rights. It was mainly cataloging various awful laws, like Dr. Parker is referring to, that have been sort of beaten back. But I think the things like access, a law regulating girls' access to abortion in Alabama, where usually there's a parental consent, a judicial bypass workaround to a parental consent law. This one required that a teen go through a trial to prove that she was capable of making this decision for herself. P.S. If she's not, should she be having a child? But
Can I give you another little coloring detail to that? That law, in the specifics of that, every state that has a parental notification has to have a judicial bypass. But in this particular case, in Alabama, they had made it possible for the court to assign a representation to the fetus. It's called a guardian ad litem, so that the state could have a compelling interest and could adjudicate that fetus's right to be born. And so that statute struck that down. So I just thought the coloring details about that were a bit more interesting than what it meant.
Yeah. And in Arkansas, there were a number of laws that we managed to get enjoined. As my colleague Bridget Amiri puts it in her blog, they were a grab bag of one insulting, harmful restriction after another, including a ban on a particular abortion method, including a requirement that a woman get permission from her, just notify, it wasn't get permission, notify her partner, even if he were her rapist, before she have an abortion. In Kentucky, there was a sort of a throwback of radical protests blocking the entrance to a clinic in Kentucky. We haven't seen that kind of activism since the 80s. And so an injunction, thankfully now we have a federal law called the Federal Access to Clinic Entrances Act FACE law, that the Justice Department, I can't believe this, but the Jeff Sessions Justice Department did file a lawsuit successfully prohibiting this. So, I mean, it's just a game of whack-a-mole, really, with these kinds of measures that are coming up. And I'm not speaking for the ACLU when I say this. I'm saying this as an observer being asked to give my opinion. I think when we look at these kinds of laws that are so intent on shaming and being punitive about unintended pregnancy in a country that has no, cohesive or coherent approach to affordable contraception, in which this administration is actually talking about removing the federal mandate for employers to provide contraception for any objection they may have, not just religious. Keep your eyes peeled. That's coming next. That also the recent ACA debate and discussion of contraception altogether is about sex, and it's about shaming women for being sexual in a non-procreative way, and all of these assaults ultimately get back to that. And the idea that a pregnancy, that you are forced to bear a child as a punishment, is the most warped way of looking at family values or what that child is supposed to mean in this world. It's to care that much about punishing women, I think, is a really terrifying thing.
I'd like to add something about language here. The first thing I want to say is how honored I am to be on this platform with Dr. Willie Parker. If there is a definition of hero, I believe you are a hero. And it's related to what I'm going to say about language, that the far right has been successful in demonizing the very word abortion. Unfortunately, the terminology pro-life is far more successful than the terminology pro-choice. Everybody is pro-life. It implies that if you're not on their side, you're against life. What could be more valuable than life? And choice has two problems with it. One is it sounds frivolous. We're constantly offered choices about, what kind of coffee you want. Do you want latte? Or, and it's a euphemism. And by being a euphemism, I talk about message and meta-message, it gives you a meta-message. It implies that the word is so terrible you can't say it. And that adds to this, to the shaming. My sister was the director of a Planned Parenthood of Mid-Hudson Valley, and she really raised my awareness of this. Even people on our side say, well, nobody's in favor of abortion, as if it's a given that this is a terrible thing. Abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Why? If you look at the, and again, it was my sister who pointed this out, did you ever see the details of cataract surgery? It's gruesome. It's awful. Should cataract surgery be rare because it's gruesome? No, people need it, they should have it. And so there's this, I think it's really been pretty widespread, successful to demonize the very word abortion, and I almost wish we didn't say we were pro-choice, but could say we are pro-abortion. We believe there should be a right to abortion.
What's been useful is to take choice away from being a noun and convert it into a verb. So choice is actually a part of choosing and deciding. And that's why what's gained a lot of traction is a broader framework rather than a legal framework of rights, one of rights, health, and justice incorporated into the concept of what's called reproductive justice. And so reproductive justice makes it possible to think about reproduction in a continuum. And it takes into account other reproductive outcomes like assisted reproductive technology, abortion, adoption, miscarriage management, surrogacy, and a whole bunch of other things that are now a part of the term reproduction. And so there's been a real fight around people whose identity they are vested in the terminology because it feels like an indictment when you say we should no longer talk about pro-choice, we should talk have a term that is more expansive. So in short, there's some gang banging that's happening within the reproductive rights, reproductive justice world around, I've been doing this work for X number of years, and it's why do we need to change the name now? But to your point, language is important, and so we got to figure out not how to fight, but how to fight fair, because what we cannot do is have this battle that ultimately results in strengthening patriarchy, because patriarchy is really the issue.
Just one quick PS about the language. It may be too late to change it. Maybe that's just the word we've got. But just a quick anecdote about the problem with it. A student of mine wrote a paper. She was pro-choice, and nobody else, it's Georgetown University, a Catholic university, no one would admit to being pro-choice, but when she interviewed them, they would say they believed that abortion should be legal in certain situations. And one student said, well, it isn't a choice, it's a necessity. Hello? Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of attention has been focused on conservatives and Republicans, but Democrats should not be left off the hook. The Democratic Party leadership just recently decided that it will support and fund anti-abortion candidates if necessary during the 2018 congressional midterm elections. So filling seats with a D behind the name, in other words, is going to take precedence over women's rights among liberals. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and even Bernie Sanders have all supported the idea of not using a litmus test with respect to reproductive rights. So the question is there such a thing as a bridge too far in the Democratic Party with respect to reproductive rights? What are the trade-offs?
I think I'm still trying to figure out what a pro-life Democrat is. Is that a covert Republican? I'm not sure. Not to your point to not to make it partisan, but I was very taken aback by the decision of the Democratic National Committee to decide whether or not they were going to be able to out Republicans, and this whole notion of deciding that abortion or reproductive rights is a losing issue is, I think, old hat for you got your ass handed to you on a plate, and you can't figure out what happened. And women and reproduction are not the issue; they're not the losing issue. But to me, sometimes when you talk about something spot on, it's harder for people to appreciate because they shut down. And so the analogy that I thought of is, if the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Party is a boat, and reproductive rights is a plank in the hull of the ship, is reproductive rights a plank in the hull of the ship, or is it a mast on a speedboat? If it's a plank in the hull of the ship, if you pull it up, you're going to sink the boat. But if it's a mast on a speedboat, it means that if the wind is not blowing, we still have a means of moving the boat, so you're optional. And so I learned from an old girlfriend, she said that never make somebody of priority who makes you optional. So the question is, how can the Democratic Party have as its core message that we are the party that supports women, we are for reproductive rights, but then equivocate on something that's as essential as the economic empowerment, whatever else you want to make as an issue of the Democratic Party that you want to champion, is all rooted for women, who are the majority of the population, in their ability to control their reproduction. So either say you're for women or not, but don't equivocate. Right now we have one party in favor that supports reproductive rights and one stridently opposed. If the party that's supportive starts to equivocate, we're going to have 1.5 parties against reproductive rights and a half party, if any effort at all. And so either say you're for women or not. Personally, I'd rather lose with women than win without them. And that's got to be the position. It's a deal breaker.
What he said.
I'm with him.
I'm with him.
I do have a personal anecdote that speaks to that, and I mean, I so agree with you, but maybe this will cast some light about why they behave the way they do. 2 other linguists and I were invited to address a gathering of Democratic senators. They get together apparently twice a year in private to talk about policy and whatever. And one of them was in charge that year, and he thought they should get control of language. We were supposed to do for the Democrats what Frank Luntz does for the Republicans. And we worked really hard on it, and we worked for months, and they didn't listen to us anyway. But at this meeting, I talked about this. I made the same point that I made now with more detail and more examples, that the term pro-life was a better choice of words than pro-choice. Nancy Pelosi was furious at me. She came down on me afterwards, like really angry, and she said, I am keeping so many of the Democratic senators in the pro-choice fold by the skin of my teeth. And if you convince them that pro-life is more magnetic to people than pro-choice, I'll lose them. It gave me, and I was devastated to think that here I am trying to do good in the world, and I felt like it was a real lesson to me to keep my mouth shut when I don't understand the situation that I'm in. But it really did give me an appreciation of what the Democratic leadership is up against, and it probably a lot of it is real politics.
But opinion polls show 70% of Americans
I know.
support access to abortion rights in most situations. And then I garbled this statistic yesterday, and I meant to look it up, so I'm going to and I didn't, so I'm going to garble it up again. But my understanding, you probably know it, is that at least a third of American women, by the time they're 40, have had at least one abortion. And the same women who have abortions overwhelmingly are the same women who have children. Those are the concepts to unify into the democratic vision, not jettisoning an issue that is central to half of its membership. And I feel very betrayed.
How many women are in the leadership board of the Democratic National Committee?
Yeah, I think that's probably part of it. I think, and that gets back to that issue, right? We need the leadership to be, diverse.
Diverse, not necessarily in sex, but diverse in thinking. Let me antagonize a bit. If you can embrace the notion that feminism is a body politic and it's not about your biology, so then as a man I can be a feminist, it shouldn't be lost on you that there are female patriarchs. And that there are women who benefit from the system as it is.
Well, that's true.
And 53% of them demonstrated it when they voted for Donald Trump, right? Because they had to decide whether or not being white or female would be their empowerment. Being white has worked for them all of their lives, and if they chose to be empowered by having a woman in the White House demonstrating the ultimate hurdle around slaying white male privilege, then now they have a new enemy. They no longer have white men to pedestalize them. So I'm saying, don't think that just because there are more women in the leadership that they're necessarily going to be feminists in their politics and their thinking. And I'm not making an argument against them, but account for the fact that there are female patriarchs as well. And so what you should be more interested in is what are their politics, but it's what's between their legs.
A couple more questions. So gender discrimination persists in the workplace, which impacts not just individual women, but their families, and of course, our entire society. Everyone is harmed by gender discrimination. But to take the title of our panel today, why are we still talking about this? And so how do we reframe the conversation around gender equality in the workplace more effectively to achieve the kind of social change that we would like to see?
Oh, okay. I'll take it. Or I'll try. Not to be a broken record, but I think that women's absence in leadership roles is a huge part of this problem, because so much of what is holding women back, I mean, I talked about structural inequality, which is huge, and that's the fact that the majority of workers in low-wage jobs with no benefits and no security and nothing, and the fact that they are majority women of color is something that has so much more to do than just with the workplace. So that's sort of another huge conversation. But in terms of when we're talking about women getting passed over for promotions, women making less vis-a-vis who's sitting next to them, sexual harassment, which we haven't even touched on and remains just an epidemic, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's not having women in leadership and not having men in leadership who are prioritizing these issues. I was talking to Alan Arfa, who I don't know if he's here anymore, but is at Paul Weiss, which is the firm that's been looking into dealing with the Fox stuff. Once an investigation started, the floodgates opened. And women came forward, and people were fired, and people got $40 million severance packages, and mixed messages. But I'll take Ailes being out of there than having him there. And it takes taking action, and that means also. And I said this yesterday, so I'm sorry that I'm repeating myself for people who heard yesterday's talk. But these issues about women's equity can't be just women in rooms talking to other women. That serves a therapeutic purpose. It serves a strategic purpose. It serves an important information sharing and strength building purpose. But in terms of righting this ship and turning things to be different, we have to have male people in charge who really are committed to this and don't just say it and don't just sign pledges to do things, but really make it part of evaluations of other managers. How well do you promote, diversity within your teams? How well have you dealt with complaints of any sort of harassment or discrimination that's come forward? And making it part of your performance as a manager, how you manage and how you promote equity. One other thing I'll say, and it's sort of on the same theme, but on the issue of pay, the lack of transparency around pay, again, putting the structural factors aside that put women into low wage and minimum wage and part-time work. But within a particular workforce, lack of transparency is a huge contributor. Because, think about it. Who among you knows what the person in the next office makes? Think about who among you knows what your best friend makes. People don't talk about it. It's totally verboten. Half of American employees work for an employer where they're either explicitly or implicitly discouraged from talking about their pay and fear they're going to be fired if they do. And so, and a lot of times employers don't even know. So my hat is off to the employers, most of them in Silicon Valley, who I think are trying to combat their very well-earned bro reputation and sexual harassment reputations as hotbeds of sexual harassment by mandating self-audits and subjecting themselves to pulling back that rock and looking what's underneath it and then dealing with the consequences. And one of the most interesting kinds of equal pay laws that are out there right now, I think, I have mixed feelings about them, but I think is kind of interesting, is laws that, I know one of them was just actually considered here in Massachusetts, laws that if an employer does a self-audit and discovers gender disparities, that if it takes concrete steps to remedy those disparities, the results of the audit cannot be used in litigation for a certain period of time. So in other words, I'm always afraid of anything that gives immunity or inoculates against, a discrimination lawsuit, but I think it's an interesting idea to try to, I hate using this as a verb, but incentivize employers to look at what's going on right under their noses and fix it.
I think one concept of, to piggyback on something you said, that how to get more men engaged, and let me kind of recalibrate something. When I said white male privilege, that was not an indictment against anyone born white or male, but it was to talk about the demographics that create power inequities that you have to think about and divest of. Gloria Steinem gave me a fair trade apparel bracelet that gave me a concept that just kind of blew my mind, and I'm still chewing on it. And it says simply, imagine if we were all linked and not ranked. Imagine if we were linked and not ranked, which is to say, when we think about the ways in which we're put in hierarchical relationships, imagine if we could deconstruct those. And when you think about whatever your particulars are, I can rattle out 4 identities that I hold right now. I'm black, male, Christian, and heterosexual. Neither of those metrics or demographics is the problem. It is the relationships around them. Being white is not the problem. Racism is. Being male is not the problem. Patriarchy is. Being gay or straight is not the problem. Homophobia is. And so when you figure out the way in which you're empowered, you have to deconstruct those relationships. So with regard to the role of men, patriarchy is the issue. So how do we make men think about divesting of power that they hold based on just being born male? You have to make it a human rights issue. Men have to understand what patriarchy costs them. We know what it costs women, but what does it cost us? At a deeper level, it costs you a part of your humanity. In order to devalue a woman, you have to lose part of your humanity to do that. So my notion of how do we get men to care, rather than just filling the room with women, again, filling the room with people whose politics are feminist and egalitarian and equal, you have to make them understand what exploitative relationships cost them. Otherwise, chivalry doesn't work. It doesn't have enough substance to kind of make men move in a way, because chivalry in many ways is self-serving. I'm thought better of if I'm chivalrous. But if I'm engaged in human rights, I do like Abraham Lincoln said. He said, as I would not be a slave, so I will not be a master, and why he freed the slaves, amongst other things. It is to say you have to want for other people what you want for yourself. And if we're going to ask men to want for women a world that women want to live in, those men have to want for themselves, want for women what they want for themselves.
One last question, and then I'll throw it open. Let's maybe end on solutions, and maybe if you could talk about things that you think we could do individually, collectively, to address gender inequities. If you have any inspirational examples you would like to share, or anything that you feel really optimistic about.
Anyone feel optimistic?
One of the things I feel optimistic about, that's, I think, an effective model for social change, that because it's such an effective model, it's being vilified and being viciously attacked, is the Black Lives Matter movement, and particularly in the way it's structured. It's not heteronormative. It's not male-centered. It's not hierarchical in terms of people who've been doing civil rights for a while and now they're the go-to people. It's really a decentralized style of leadership that is intersectional in its analysis of problems. It's about carceral justice. It's about shackling in pregnancy. It's about a whole bunch of other things. So I think I would offer as an example, even though it's being vilified and attacked, is a decentralized model of social change like the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah. Yeah, and joking aside, because obviously it's very easy to get feel sort of beaten down these days, but I actually would build on that by saying the outpouring of everyday activism that we have seen since the election is so unprecedented and is so heartening. And I think the key to it, because it's a marathon, not a sprint. And we're only 6 months in, everybody. It feels like years and years, but we're only 6 months in, and the way to keep your eye on the ball, I think, is to be directed to what you are most passionate about and what keeps you energized. For instance, I'm not a march person. I'm not someone, I went to the Women's March, but then there was a march like every single weekend for a few weeks there. Now, some people, that's valuable. That getting those people, those feet on the street and those aerial pictures of crowds of thousands of people, those matter. That's not what's going to move me. So picking a particular issue and choosing to be activist on that issue, there is so much that's going on at the state and local level in terms of legislation, because DC is just hopeless. And so there are so many great bills being introduced in state legislatures and city councils about equal pay, about paid family leave, about pregnant workers' rights, get activists around LGBT, rights and anti-discrimination measures. I think also I am putting in a plug here to check out the ACLU's effort called People Power, which is sort of the analog to Indivisible, although the Indivisible people are phenomenal as well. Black Lives Matter is phenomenal as well. And what People Power is trying to do is to channel people around the country into exactly the kinds of efforts that are right for them. And it could be when there's a hate incident in a community to send a bunch of people to the mosque or whatever was the target and, meet with them and just extend olive branches. I mean, the kind of sort of self-care and other care that we need to be doing, I think, is part and parcel of the activism that we also need to be pursuing.
I will be really, really brief. One has to feel optimistic thinking about the progress that has been made in the area of gay rights. I'm old enough that my best friend, who is gay, I lived through his going to therapy to get cured, because that was what people did at that time. his own therapist saying to him, when I go down the street and I see someone who's gay, I know it because they won't look me in the eye.
Jesus.
A therapist. And to see gay people getting married, and it's public, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg is marrying a gay couple. I think one has to realize progress can be made,
Yes.
and that's at least an area in which
Yes.
we can be happy about that.
That is very true.
And just real quick, what we can do, since I started with a double bind, when you feel yourself reacting negatively to someone, ask yourself, especially a woman, ask yourself would you react in the same way if it were a man saying the same thing and doing the same thing. For example, not smiling.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, I think that's it, except for Sue Ellen's coming back. Okay.
It's been a long day, and I know everybody wants to go home, but it's